welcome back. And we are moving into our first conversation for today, where we're going to have our eyes opened as to the reality of Belizean male victims of domestic violence. We have a current law student who is joining us, and she actually was the one who carried out the research. And Gaurica Makhijani is with us, and I'm very interested to find out more. Good morning and welcome.
Good morning. I'm definitely excited to share what I have found.
Yeah. So Gaurica, tell us, first of all, what prompted you as a law student to venture into doing this research, and specifically about male domestic violence victims?
Well, firstly, in my third year, we get the option to pick certain courses that we want to do, and so I decided to take a gender course, and from there, I was just amazed by the different issues that plague our country, and domestic violence just stood out to me. And I'm a very strong proponent for equality, and I'm just been passionate about it ever since, from when I was little. So, for example, I think men and women are as capable of doing things. So a woman should be able to, know how to use a lawnmower. A guy should be able to wash dishes. I mean, I think it's totally normal. And in the same light, I feel that men have been victimized for a very long time. They've been accused of being perpetrators, but they are also victims, and they're suffering silently. So I feel it's my duty to society to share this research and to just create awareness about it.
So, recognizing that there were male domestic violence victims and that we know very little about them, what process did you go through in being able to try to get this information? Because one of the things we hear very often from anybody who speaks about domestic violence is that men are not comfortable reporting.
Right. Well, it wasn't easy to get the information, but what I did was I spoke to the officers from all the districts, and
police officers.
The officers from the women's department, and also some police officers. And what I did was I began a conversation where I would prompt them with different questions. So what it did was it revealed to me that, as we will get into shortly, that while men are very hesitant to reporting, some of them have come forward, and they have revealed several of the challenges, which I will reveal to you guys shortly, that basically they're challenged with every single day, and they're still somehow able to come out. And usually what happens is as a result of just bottling up those emotions and then coming to a point where, you know what, I came to the women's department today because I need counseling, I need advice, because I can't hold it, I can't keep this any longer, but I don't want to bring a charge, I don't want to go to the police station, I just need someone to talk to.
What was the attitude of the persons who you were, because your research is interview based, appears. What was their attitude? Were they like, because one of the complaints is that men don't want to make formal complaints because they are afraid of being ridiculed. What was the approach of the authorities that you interviewed in relation to the incidences of male domestic violence?
Their approach in when I interviewed them, or their approach to...
Yes, when you were asking them, listen, I'm doing a research paper on male domestic violence.
Well, the first thing was some of them were like, you mean male? I'm like, yes, I mean male. and the sad reality is, when you hear domestic violence, you automatically think female. You picture a woman, bruised, and that's what you think. And I want to develop a conversation where we could just get rid of this notion.
Yeah. And that's where one of the definitions is absolutely most important in identifying what domestic violence is. Because if we understand what it is, then we understand how men are also victims.
Right.
Tell us.
Okay. So according to Chapter 178 of the Revised Edition 2011 of the Belize Domestic Violence Act, Section 2 of the Interpretation Act defines domestic violence as anything emotional, psychological, financial, physical that someone has done to another, whether it is a child, a de facto spouse, etc. And it is very critical that I explain how these instances could actually manifest, because there is this misconceived notion that domestic violence is about physical abuse, about hitting someone, but it extends far beyond that. So for example, and I will give you live instances that have happened here in Belize. So emotional and psychological. What is that? It's really belittling a person. It's breaking and just crushing their self-esteem. And it's the constant use of just this verbal interaction that takes place. So, for example, when I was speaking to one of the officers, she said to me that men would constantly complain of women telling them stuff like this. You're only fat. You're lucky I'm there with you. If I left you, nobody else don't want you. You see, men are equally emotional, but we don't consider that. And financial now. Under the Act, financial means controlling, possessing, taking control over the person's possessions in order to have the upper hand. And another example of that would be women would require the husband to give all their paycheck to them. And they control everything, basically.
Yeah.
And they have to get permission to use the money.
But there's a distinction between, I would imagine, between saying, okay, in this relationship, you're better at handling money, go ahead and do it, versus I must beg you for a penny. Well, a penny in Belize is nothing. I must beg you for $10 to get a basic necessity.
Well, I'm talking about the latter.
Okay. Yeah. No,
because,
yeah.
Right. Because there are differences, but it's really, I need money to just to go to the bus or get a bus fare, things like that. And now we have sexual abuse, which is very interesting, but it's happening today.
Well, this is one we really, I think people want to be able to understand.
Right, and I'll give you an example of how that manifests itself. Let's say both of y'all are married, right? And you tell him, well, if you not pay me, you not get nothing. Basically, simple as that. This is happening.
In a relationship.
Yes, and it's so upsetting because this shouldn't be the case. And now, physical. You, of course, have hitting, scratching instances where women have thrown hot boiling water on a man. Or how about this one? This happened, and of course, there was no names mentioned, but it happened here in Belize. This was a married couple, and the woman bit the man's penis. And then he in retaliation, pushed her. And the first thing she did was went to report to the police that she was being abused. And when confronted, he never told the police officer what she had done to him. And the reason I could tell you this today is because he went to the women's department. He was desperate and he just needed counseling. So he went and he spoke. He said, this is what happened, but I don't want any charges. I'm ashamed. I don't want to talk about it. And what we see with all these instances that I mentioned, from financial to emotional, is one common thing. It's embarrassing. It's uncomfortable. Which man wants to be revealing that, hey, this is what's happening to me?
Yeah. Well, what I liked about your report was how much it referenced what happens in the rest of the Caribbean. And there's a reason why I appreciated that, because if we look at the socialization of our men in Belize, it's more Caribbean based than being based in Central America. And it's very much believed that we have alpha males in Belize. We have men who are seen as the power, or those who are in control, especially in relationships. And so, I don't like saying it like that, because I do see changes within society today.
Of course.
But that has for a long time been perceived as how the relationship structure is. I know even in topics like we'll have later about HIV, that's kind of how issues are approached. So my question is it because it goes against what people perceive a man should tolerate or should put themselves in a situation to be able to have happen to them? Is that what is the basis of the fair?
And that's precisely the point I wanted to draw to. When I did my research, I realized that we're attacking the symptoms. We're not attacking the root of the problem. And the root of the problem really is culture and gender socialization. And that leads me to a term called hegemonic masculinity. And what that is really a universal standard of accepted norms of what it is to be a male, that men feel forced to subscribe to so that they could maintain that masculine identity. And anything that doesn't fall within that line, they try to avoid any feminine behavior. So this is why they would avoid communicating emotions, for instance. And culture and gender socialization basically is a way of transmitting culture. So what we do is, by our daily interactions, we learn accepted roles and prescribed norms that are expected of us. So this is why we see that basically culture has made women expressive, and they've made expression a woman thing, whereas if a man expresses themselves, they're considered weak.
Yeah. And if we take this down, sorry, just one thing, because I wanted to I imagine people seeing this in the realm of adults, right? But if we take this down to childhood behavior, I think that's one of the clear areas where you can see where we impose gender stereotypes. Right. So the little boy falls down, get up and stop crying. The little girl falls down and it's like, oh, are you okay? Did you get a cut? Did you get bruised? Don't worry, cry. And that's kind of where it starts, right?
Yes.
Can I ask this? To put it in a less romantic setting, are you saying that it is that the way we're socialized, that domestic violence against men is almost the norm, it's expected? So if my wife hits me, it's okay, but if I hit her, we're culturally taught that that is wrong. Is it that we're saying that?
No, not exactly. What I'm saying is that because of the way we're expected to behave, men basically bottle up and keep quiet about it, because men don't speak about feelings. Men don't cry. Men don't do these things. So even man on man, they don't want to tell their guy friend, hey, you know, this is happening in my home, because then they become less of a man somehow. And they don't want to be seen that way.
Let's look at what the statistics say, because sometimes we know that there's low reporting in male victims of domestic violence. Yes. But what do we typically understand about how often there are victims, male domestic violence victims, in Belize or in the Caribbean?
Okay, so regionally, it is underreported, and it's a huge problem, and for the very same reasons as mentioned. But when I conducted my research here in Belize, I found, for instance, in Curacao, for the month, out of 20 cases, 10 are women and 10 are men.
Wow.
For the month. And in Belize City now, it's less. It's like 3 for the month. 3 men would come forward and seek advice.
Wow.
So what are your thoughts on that? Is it underreporting in Belize City?
I think overall, it's not that because it's 10 in one district and 3 in another means that it's underreported in one. It's underreported everywhere. This is a result of men coming forward because it has been going on for so long that they've bottled up so much that they come to the women's department to report these incidents.
Now, and I want to go back to that whole issue of, because it's an interesting one.
Sure.
Now, when the victim is a male, some people might argue, you know what, he probably deserved it because he probably was caught in infidelity, which is probably the most frequent infraction. And so he will take the beating as opposed to correcting his behavior, because for some reason, after taking a hit in the head or being thrown with a pot, you know, that he's somewhat forgiven and the relationship continues. So my question is, how did you approach it's a wider question, how did you approach your study? Because we're looking at different components. We're looking at adult males, we're looking at parent to child, And did your research allow you to venture into some of the LGBT, the gay community? And how did that play out?
Okay, well, I looked specifically at males being abused. I didn't look at children in particular, just males. And it's important to find out the causes as well.
I mean, when you say male, you mean male adults?
Male adults, male victims of domestic violence. And it's important also to identify the causes, but it still goes back to the cultural stereotypes, because you're telling me that because a man, he was caught in the act of adultery or he was cheating, we say, well, it's okay. It's fine that a woman could go, it's justified, and it's also justified that he is then being abused for it.
You know, another part of that is that what we don't recognize, I don't know if you agree with this, is that we have a sexist bias to believe that men are violent.
Yes.
But women, from your study, are equally. Particularly in Corozal, are equally violent. Was that surprising to you?
It really wasn't, and I think it would be wrong to say particularly in Corozal.
Well, from the study, 10 and 10?
Right, but I mean, it can fluctuate and it can vary over time. Yeah. The issue is, how safe has our environment been? How safe have we created that men feel comfortable to come forward and speak about these issues? So really and truly, it's not an adequate reflection of how many people are, how many male victims are in our country. It's not an accurate. It's just the few that decided to come out.
It's trying to look at the causes, yeah. Now, I think one of the important elements here is that our perception of domestic violence, as you clearly said, is a woman cowering in the corner, being beaten almost to death. And we hear stories of domestic violence survivors, women specifically, who one day run out because they know if they don't leave, they will die. Right. And I think that particular image is very difficult for the wider public to shift from a male's perspective. And so my question is, how much is this a matter of a male choosing not to respond in a violent manner when they're being specifically physically abused? In other words, I can beat up on my husband, and because he knows it's so wrong to hit me back, he becomes the victim and it's not an actual brawl.
Usually, it can be because, again, going back to culture, growing up, a man could see that that happened to his father, and then when he gets older, he feels like, okay, this is normal. Or sometimes they feel so guilty, maybe they did cheat, and so they feel that they deserve it, and they feel that they have to take it because they're a man, and they can't come out and say, well, my woman beat me, so they're just gonna take it.
When you were doing this very interesting research, I think it's the first of the kind that I've heard of, and I'm very happy it's out there, because it starts a conversation. Mm-hmm. These are critical conversations. Was there anything, because your angle is law,
right?
And a lot of this is social psychology.
Yes.
Was there any area that when you were doing this study that you said, man, I want to delve further into that because that's very interesting, and probably ventured off into some psychology, some psychological analysis of it, or wanted to at least, even if you didn't?
Well, of course, and what surprises me is that people don't understand that it's not just the law and the state. There's a lot of sociology involved in it and socialization that takes place that we need to address. So, and as you mentioned, the law, which I wanted to jump into because it reflects another barrier. As per Section 24 of the Act and Section 33, it requires and mandates that police officers assess and basically any complaint that is being done or any alleged complaint, even if it's not by the victim himself, mm-hmm. they ought to address it.
To investigate.
Mm-hmm. They're supposed to. But when we look at the law in practice, it's a different thing. It sounds great on paper, but what's actually happening is what I assessed. And what I found is that many men, and in all the districts, they claim to be ridiculed and mocked. So we already have established that there's a cultural barrier. So it's already difficult for men to come out. And when they do, they're being ridiculed, they're being mocked.
There is a specific unit that one accesses when they go to make a complaint on domestic violence. It's the, I don't know if it's still the domestic violence unit or is it the family violence?
It's the domestic violence unit.
But they're supposed to be trained in gender sensitivity and in some of these practices. Now, I know from speaking with police officers that often what happens is the rotation means that I might be trained in it, but I end up in some other department. Is that part of what a problem is?
Okay, so what I looked at too was, is this police force adequately trained and equipped? No, I know that the women's department has really tried. They offer training at least once a year, but for the past 2 years, this has not been the case. And the other issue is, even though they have been training, is it sufficient? And the answer is no, it's not. Because in practice, when we question the victims, they don't feel safe. And that's the proof. They don't feel that they're taken seriously.
And they don't want what is already an embarrassing situation for them to be compounded with ridicule.
Exactly.
Now, the law is, would you agree the law is written in a neutral tone?
Yes.
Would you say that because there are certain challenges which are specific to males as it relates to domestic violence, that the writing and tone of neutrality in the law actually negatively affects the challenges which men face in relation to domestic violence? And should, if that is so, be changed to somehow tip the balance to get it back more to a more equal standing?
Well, the law is without critique as to its gender neutrality, and I have no problem with it. We've actually come a long way from getting rid of a lot of our archaic laws. And
this one.
And while that is great, my issue here is there is a gap between the law and adequate implementation.
The implementation, yeah. And so the law doesn't say anything regarding male, female, or child. It's just very simple, purposefully inflicting.
It recognizes, it says males, females, children. It's perfect, it's fine. But the problem is we are not assessing the root of the problem, which is a cultural stereotype that precludes us. Because what happens is the police force is a force that harbors hegemonic masculinity. It doesn't conceive of men, it doesn't allow them to conceive of men as victims. And basically men suffer because of patriarchy.
But not necessarily victims. It's not just the police society, it's society. We don't see them as emotional beings.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But, sorry, just to follow up. The law is like a train track. It puts you in a direction. It's a focus of policy. So if the law wants to deal with children who are underage, who are having sexual activity, who are having sex, then it points to the law, for example, in African knowledge, for you to deal with that. So the law is a focusing mechanism. In the case of males, if we are saying that there's a specific problem, and I'll give you a more specific example. I'm going back to that again. Take, for example, if your research had shown that there's a high incidence of male domestic violence in the LGBTI community.
Right.
And the law does not specifically name same-sex partners in the law.
Right.
Then it does a disbenefit to that community because it does not focus the law on it. And in Belize, laws are read very literally.
Right.
So, do you think that if they were to take the extra mile, and I'll give you one more example. When it comes to custody of children, the law says that an unmarried lady is entitled to and shall have custody of her child. So the law focuses that to bring some balance because they realize that there is a little bit of inequity.
Okay.
So going back to the question, do you believe that in relation to domestic violence, that maybe a little bit more oomph can be put in there to tip the balance, to deal with some of the cultural norms?
Right.
But hold on, can I just say, we did have a case of a same-sex domestic violence go to the courts.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So it works.
Rather than it being the exception than the norm. Because everyone should feel, as you say, safe. And the law should be the first ground on which people feel safe. Correct?
I feel like I'm in a legal battle. You want her to agree to your point.
No.
So, okay. So, there are, I guess, in a way, as you mentioned, the law could possibly go further. And I do agree with you. And it's a point I did want to make up eventually. There is nothing that specifically speaks to same-sex male victims or female victims. There is no way for them to engage with the justice system. There's nothing that specifically speaks to them, and under the act it speaks to like same household members. But as you said, and in practice, the judges don't really consider that. It's not within their contemplation. So I would definitely say that an extension needs to be added, because everyone needs to feel safe and everyone needs to feel that they are getting adequate protection of the law, regardless of their gender, sex, age, ethnicity, etc.
I'm kind of stuck on, and I know because of how your brains are wired, you're thinking about the law. I'm thinking from a practical standpoint.
Sure.
Because I think that where we sometimes have some really great laws, and you pointed out before, it does at least cover the basis in keeping it neutral. But it's getting to the point where you take it to court, where you have the strength and courage, male or female, to call the domestic violence unit, to go into the police department, to let people know quite publicly, my relationship is failing. Because that's what it is. That's a public confession of failure. Right. I chose the wrong partner. One that hits me, one that psychologically abuses me and makes me feel less than this sometimes. And so I'm wondering, because it's hard for women too. It is. I'm very sure female victims are looking and saying, well, what about us, you know? And I hope they know that this is a sensitivity. We have absolute sensitivity, but we still want to see the flip side. So what about the system? Did you identify needs to be changed to meet people where they are? Because it's so hard already to come forward. What do we need to do from the other end to kind of bridge the gap?
Another issue is, do we have a specific organization for men? And the answer is not really. No, we don't. Now, in practice, the women's department...
You mean like a men's department?
The women's department has
been...
They have been catering
to male issues.
And I was like, but then why are you called women's department if you're going to be... Because it's not encouraging them to come forward. And the only reason most of them come forward and they have confessed is because they've been bottling it up for so long that they just feel like they need to get this off their chest.
Yeah.
God works in mysterious ways. I've said this so many times.
Yeah, but I still disagree. I fundamentally disagree. If you have, let's say you change it to gender department, and primarily women will seek it out. Men will see the gender department as women's department nonetheless. If there is to be a separate men's department, if you go to, and there are many different places you can think of that we see primarily utilized by women that we just naturally classify that's a woman's thing, woman's place. Yes. But I do think there's a great need to focus on men's services. But like I keep on telling Kevin, you know, the women's department has a lot of work, and sometimes I wish that strong men in our society would get together and advocate for it, because isn't it the very same issue you're fighting when you say women's department? When are you going to do a men's department? I mean, how does this make sense?
I hear you, but just to close up, just close up that point, because I think what you raise is a very important issue, and I have a little bit different view, because it's like the police department, and in the police department you have different sections. So you have the domestic violence unit, even though it's the police department, and so I fully advocate for a gender department, because it's a misnomer to call it a women's department when in fact you're supposed to be providing services to all genders. But
no, what I said was if it is that they are catering to men as well, then might as well change the name.
It's a misnomer.
If you're gonna do that. Or you could just have something specific for men and just continue with.
So it could be gender department, and then you have a subsection which is women's department, and then
as
male's
you
department.
rightly mentioned,
Men won't go. They'll see it as a woman's place. We know that. How many men go to a hairdresser if it's mostly women going there? Very few. They want to go to the barber, where it's predominantly men.
If you have locks, you have to go to a hairdresser.
It doesn't matter what is the percentage. And if you're going to be investing in something, if you're going to be putting in resources, human or financial, then you want it to be effective from the start.
And that's the problem. What I did notice too in my research was that whenever they would have these conferences or campaigns, it's mostly women and children that are attending. Yeah. So now the question is, what do we do to get the men to get out there and feel involved and feel like it's okay to be a part of it, because they are included in it. The act protects them as equally as it protects women. So it all goes back to, again, as I reiterate, the cultural and social stereotypes. How do we attack that? And it's very simple. We need to attack every institution possible, from family to the wider community to school. Every institution needs to be attacked.
Yeah. You know what I find interesting, and I want to be able to tie it together. We're talking male domestic violence victims, and the assumption is as the perpetrator as a female. If it's a same sex, it'll be a male. But what you're speaking about, the socialization, the gender stereotypes that we continue to place on boys, because that's where it starts, or little boys.
Yes.
And I always use one of the main examples, which is boys are less exclusively breastfed than girls. And we're talking babies. And for me, that is a startling reality to show how we differentiate and care from a child is months old or days old. And so it seems that there has to be a general messaging to say, we care for boys too. But this takes me back to the study on male participation in urban violence, where again, I go back to Dr. Gale saying, and I know I've said it many times, where he simply said in his press conference, mothers, hug your sons. And I feel that we are kind of tackling the root causes in the same way. I'm hearing the same root causes coming out from two very diverse studies, from victims of domestic violence to men participating in violence. So I hear you moving to this point, and I really want you to be able to explain it further. What do we need to be doing with our boys so they don't become victims, or they feel assertive enough that if they do become victims, they'll do something about it?
One, it starts at home. We need to start encouraging parents to socialize their kids a little bit differently, especially their males. It's okay, son, to cry, to tell me how you feel when you're sad, to communicate emotions. It's fine. Share with me your hopes, your dreams, your weaknesses, your fears. Tell me, I'm here. That's how it starts. It's in a very subtle manner. It's those little things that we don't see that affect us, because it's through socialization that we learn what's accepted of us, what is to be a man, what is to be a woman, and what's okay and what's not okay. We just learn it, and we learn it from very little. And step two, if it is that the parents aren't doing it, fine, we can't get that institution. Let's hit school. Let's go there. If they're not gonna learn it at home, let's target the school. And I firmly believe that I think that we should have mandatory gender courses, because students are not aware that, you know what, me and you, we're equal. I am as capable. And that needs to take place. And now I know that the Women's Department has a manual, and they have a yearly training session called the Gender Awareness Safe Child. But we need more. And what I'm saying is, we are trying, but is it working? Has it been effective? And that's what I assessed. And I realized that we need to do more. We need to push more.
Both from a practical standpoint, and I want to move away from the legal side of it, because the law is not only neutral,
yes,
but it's also very general. Okay, it has to be that way.
It has to.
But from a very practical standpoint, how do you know where the line is to abuse as a male? How do you know that this is just not, you know, my wife is upset with me right now, so she called me ugly?
Or I slap you.
Or you know, I did something wrong and she just, how do I know
or you
when
just annoy her.
Yes, that's normal.
Okay. A little slap and a little punch every now and then is fine.
What?
I mean, if that's how you play, but the difference and the point that needs to be drawn is the constant. How constant is it? How repetitive is it? I mean, one day you could have just really upsetted and you just lashed out, but that's different from it happening every single day.
Yeah.
You know, and that's what draws the line. And trust me,
I have to say for the record that in my opinion, one act, and that is the way to go back to law in terms of cruelty, that one act of violence is one too much.
Well, I was going to ask, because didn't the definition say purposefully inflicting? I'm trying to recall.
Yeah, but...
So is it intent? Is it that, okay, we're joking around and I want to show you how hard I can punch?
Right.
That's one thing.
Right.
But if, you know, you just walk in, I had a bad day and you let me use you as my punching bag.
Right. There's a drawing line between, I mean, some couples, they like to spar, that's how they
wrestle,
play.
yeah.
They wrestle, but there's the intention, as you rightly mentioned, the intent to inflict pain, you know, for whatever reason, to control the person, then that's where you begin to draw the line.
Wow, we are out of time. One question.
My question was, finally, this is a very important discussion.
Yes.
But what benefits do you think, because as Marlene was asking earlier, that we normally approach this from the female standpoint, do you think that there are any benefits to be had for the general genderhood, if I could say, of persons, with male, females, same-sex couples? Do you think that there's any specific benefits that we would garner if we were to open more the study that you've done on male domestic violence? Do you think that there's any benefits specifically coming straight from that angle?
Of course, there's definitely benefits. First of all, justice. Mm-hmm. Justice and just promoting equality and getting it out there, and also to prevent it from further occurring, because once you see those signs, then you know what, I need to get out of this relationship. It's not healthy, it's toxic, I don't need to be in this situation, and the law protects me.
Where would you like to see it go after this? After this study?
Yeah, and also where people can access it, because I know people will be contacting us to see it after.
Well, I'm yet to publish it, but I do intend to do so. But I would definitely like to see it infused in school. Mm-hmm. I would really like that we work more intensely with the police force. I would really like to see it there, because if victims don't feel that they could go to a police officer who's supposed to be protecting them, then we have a huge problem. Mm-hmm. We do. So I would like to see it there, and I would also like to see those resources, and also attacking every institution, especially the home. If we do all of that, we are supposed to expect changes, but we have to be relentless about it.
Mm-hmm. All right. Thank you so much for coming in and sharing this with us. And, you know, I really appreciate that you took it on yourself to be able to undertake this study. And, you know, I imagine next year maybe you'll come back with something as interesting or even diving deeper. But thank you very much. We appreciate it. We are going to go ahead and take a break. And when we come back, we will be talking about the first annual National Testing Day. So stay tuned.